What is the greatest I'll do it myself in history? Story 1. Failed chicken farmer from Spain wages personal war of lies against Nazi Germany and wins. Okay, so it's time for me to talk about Juan Pujol Garcia. A hotel clerk and former unsuccessful chicken farmer was frustrated with the fascist government of Spain, and Germany's warmongering was getting scary. France had fallen, the USSR and USA were both neutral so far, and only Britain was left to stand against the Nazis. As he said years later, he believed he had to do something for the good of humanity, even though, by all accounts, he was a nobody, just a hotel clerk and failed chicken farmer who'd briefly served on both sides of the Spanish Civil War, leaving with a dislike of fascism and communism both. So Juan naturally decided to become a spy and screw Hitler as hard as he could. Logical career move for a hotel clerk, I'm sure you'll agree. But the British, who he wanted to help, weren't interested. He'd asked to help at the embassy in Madrid several times. The Brits were all like, "Who are you? Actually, never mind, we don't care. You can't do crap to help us, and we don't really trust you, so scram." Juan, of course, was undeterred. He decided that the Nazis had to be destroyed, and he figured it would be easier to do so from within. So he reinvents himself as a fanatically fascist government official and applies to help the Germans spy on the Brits, claiming he has a way to actually get undercover in Britain to spy on them. All of this, of course, is utter crap. The Germans say, sure, we could use the help, and hire him. Since he can't get to Britain, he goes to Lisbon, Portugal, frequenting the library to learn about Britain so he can convincingly just make up crap. He sends the German Navy on a wild goose chase for a non-existent naval convoy on the Mediterranean island of Malta. The Germans are convinced he's the best spy they have in Britain. After all, the rest of them keep getting captured, except for the ones Garcia is recruiting, or rather, inventing. His recruits were as real as a Maltese convoy, which is to say, not even a little real. They did make good fall guys to blame when his intel was off. The Brits, meanwhile, are looking for him since the German codes they were breaking showed the Germans allegedly had a spy setting up a spy ring in Britain. But then they read his messages. Juan allegedly had a Scottish contact who would do anything for a liter of wine. That tipped the Brits off that someone was just messing with German intel. I mean, metric system? Anyone? A Scotsman who drinks wine? Unrealistic. So eventually, the Lisbon British Embassy tipped off MI6 that this guy in Lisbon was trying to tell them he was literally a German intelligence agent and would like to help fight the Nazis, please. So they brought him to Britain and gave him the codename Agent Garbo. He teamed up with MI6, where he continued to mess with the Nazis with a combination of pure lies, true but useless intel, and useful intel that arrived just a bit too late to help the Germans at all. He convinced the Germans D-Day was a feint, not the main Allied invasion. That would come farther east at Calais, he convinced the Germans. The first U.S. Army group led by General Patton would lead it. The first U.S. Army group was made of divisions that didn't exist, in an empty base, with inflated fake tanks and airplanes to convince German planes flying above Dover to think it was legit. The Germans kept a large number of troops and tank divisions back at Calais to repel an invasion force that never even landed. These troops would have stopped the Allied landings at Normandy. Instead, they sat in Calais doing nothing. The Germans gave Pujol the Iron Cross Second Class for his essential aid to the Nazi regime. The British government soon after made him a member of the Order of the British Empire. His German spy handler gave him his Iron Cross in person after the war, apologizing profusely for failing to win the war he'd helped them so much with. I imagine it was difficult to keep a straight face during that conversation. Story 2. Sir Nicholas Winton, who was a British man during the 1900s who helped save around 669 children of mostly Jewish origin from Czechoslovakia to Britain before the start of World War II. He was just a broker who kept up on the news from Czechoslovakia, but from what I remember, he went all the way to Prague and tried to figure out what he could do. I watched an interview, and it was a lot of forging of documents and blackmail that he did, I think, to get the children into Britain. He didn't say anything about it for the next 50 years. He just served in the army as well during World War II. This is a screw it. If no one is going to help these kids, then I will, in my opinion. Sadly, I think there was another train full of 200 more kids, but it didn't get to depart because the war started that day. Most of all the kids who he saved, their parents died in camps like Auschwitz, and that probably included those 200 kids that never got on the train. He found the kids he did save, people willing to adopt them. This was known as a Czech Kindertransport, German for children's transport, and he was knighted as well by the Queen. And this is why he is Sir Nicholas Winton. There's a movie called Nicky's Family about it, as well as a 60 Minutes episode on him. He died in 2015 at the age of 106, but not without meeting a lot of the children who are now adults. There was one sad part I saw in an interview with one of the children. It's that his parents had told him that he was going to go on a trip to the UK alone and that they would join him a few months later. He never realized this was the last time he'd see his parents, and he was asked what his parents looked like. Were they scared, panicked, sad? I think he said he asked this question himself many times, and I think he ultimately said they were calm, I think. But this, in my opinion, is one of the big screw it, I'll do it myself moments. Story 3. Joan of Arc's entire career was a giant screw it, I'll do it myself. She had no military experience, she had no money, she was only in her mid-teens, but her country was losing a war, and so did it. She talked her way into a meeting with the king, talked her way into a sword and a suit of armor and a horse, and talked her way into permission to travel with a supply train. When she got to the siege, the guys who were actually running the siege treated her like a mascot, but screw it. She crashed war meetings to which she hadn't been invited and pretty much told everybody to go screw themselves, then went off to lead soldiers into battle. Strangely enough, the soldiers followed her. Even more strangely, they started capturing towers. Then she got shot in the shoulder with a crossbow bolt. It was just about the same wound that had killed Richard and Lionheart 2 centuries earlier, but once again, screw it. She pulled the bolt out with her own hands, which isn't exactly the smart thing to do with puncture wounds, but screw it. She grabbed a banner and rallied the next charge, which was a pretty damn good thing because that was about the time the enemy army decided to give up the siege. She could have rested up and gone home at that point. After all, she pretty much only had one usable arm by then, but, well, yeah, screw it. She started capturing more strongholds. After a particularly lopsided battle called the Battle of Pantai, the enemy army was decimated. So she led her king on a march to get a proper coronation, but there were a lot of towns under enemy control along the way. This could pose a problem, but you already know, screw it. That string of towns switched without a fight, because, hell, she had the whole army with her. Then there was no formal role for a peasant girl from the middle of nowhere at a royal coronation, but yep, screw it. She stood beside the king holding her banner while he got crowned. Now, as an example of exactly what bad shape things were generally for France at that point, Paris was behind enemy lines. Once again, screw it. She attacked Paris, and once again got shot, this time in the leg. She refused to leave the field and kept directing troops. At about this time, the political scene at court started turning against her because she was getting too far powerful, far too fast, and she was chronically insubordinate. She didn't get the chance to lead the main army again, but screw it. She kept leading small forces because this was the feudal era and troops were loyal to a particular lord, not like modern military structure. So there were noblemen who respected her accomplishments enough that they invited her to command the troops under them. How she figured out tactics so fast without any experience is kind of a mystery, but a lot of it seems to be that she was aggressive and pushed an advantage at a time when the norm had been demoralized and timid. They also said she had a knack for artillery placement, artillery being mostly crossbows and really primitive muscle-loading proto-cannons. Without the main army, there wasn't a whole lot to work with, but screw it. After a few more small battles, she got captured. Damn, she did her level best to escape and nearly broke free because screw it. You probably heard about the rest, a kangaroo court trial where she sparred with her judges verbally every day. Several transcripts survived where she threatens her judges to fear for their souls. All of them were learned churchmen, including a bishop, but screw it. And guess who's the only person from that courtroom who got made a saint? Story 4. Leo Major, French-Canadian soldier during World War II, captured a German-held town by himself. At the beginning of April, the Regiment de la Chaudière was approaching the city of Zwolle, which was known to have a strong German resistance. The commanding officer asked for 2 volunteers to recon the German force before the artillery began firing in the city. Private Major and his friend Corporal Willie Arseignan stepped forward to accept the task. To keep the city intact, the pair decided to try capture Zwolle alone, though they were only supposed to ascertain the German numbers and try to contact the Dutch resistance. Around midnight, Arseignan was killed by German fire after accidentally giving away the pair's position. Enraged, Major killed 2 of the Germans, but the rest of the group fled in a vehicle. He decided to continue his mission alone. He entered Zwolle near Sassenpoort and came upon a staff car. He ambushed and captured the German driver and then led him to a bar where an armed officer was taking a drink. After disarming the officer, he found that they could both speak French. The officer was from Alsace. Major told him that at 6 a.m. Canadian artillery would begin firing on the city, which would cause numerous casualties among both the German troops and the civilians. The officers seemed to understand the situation, so Major took a calculated risk and let the man go, hoping they would spread the news of their hopeless position instead of rallying the troops. As a sign of good faith, he gave the German his gun back. Major then proceeded to run throughout the city, firing his submachine gun, throwing grenades, and making so much noise that he fooled the Germans into thinking that the Canadian army was storming the city in earnest. As he was doing this, he would attack and capture German troops. About 10 times during the night, he captured groups of 8 to 10 German soldiers and escorted them out of the city and handed them over to French-Canadian troops waiting in the vicinity. After transferring his prisoners, he would return to Zwolle to continue his assault. 4 times during the night, he had to force his way into civilians' houses to rest. He eventually located the Gestapo HQ and set the building on fire. Later stumbling upon the SS HQ, he engaged in a quick but deadly fight with 8 Nazi officers. 4 were killed and the others fled. He noticed that 2 of the SS men he had just killed were disguised as resistance members. The Zwolle resistance had been, or was going to be, infiltrated by the Nazis. By 4:30 a.m., the exhausted major found out that the Germans had retreated. Zwolle had been liberated and the resistance contacted. Walking in the street, he met 4 members of the Dutch resistance. He informed them that the city was now free of Germans. Major found out later that morning that the Germans had fled to the west of the Riven Idjessel, and perhaps more importantly, that the planned shelling of the city would be called off and his regiment could enter the city unopposed. Major then took his dead friend back to the Van Gunne farm until regimental reinforcements could carry him away. He was back at camp by 9 a.m., and for his actions, he received the Distinguished Conduct Medal. Story 5. Medicine has a few of these. Jonas Salk, when he needed test subjects for the polio vaccine, looked around and decided he'd make a fine test subject himself. Well, he and his family, so maybe that's not the best example. The best example, after all, is Werner Forsman. The year is 1929, and the conventional wisdom among the medical community is that sticking things into your heart will kill you, which, as far as wacky things people once believed goes, is really a reasonable thing to assume. When people are shot through the heart, for instance, and not in the metaphoric way that gives love a bad name, they tend to die. Now, if you could pierce the heart, you'd be able to deliver medicine that way to people that otherwise couldn't take it intravenously. Years later, what happened next is instrumental to Dr. Clarence Dennis and Richard Vargo. In 1950, developing cardiac bypass, and 2 years after that, in 1952, Dr. F. John Lewis performing the world's first open heart surgery. Werner, of course, didn't have quite that much prescience, but being able to inject dyes into people's hearts and then x-ray them, an idea he did have, was revolutionary. Werner knew what the rewards were, but he also, of course, knew what the risks were. He wouldn't violate his Hippocratic oath, and this sort of thing was fatal to a career in medicine. In fact, when he pulled off what I'm about to tell you, he was actually disciplined and shunned by the cardiac community. He was forced to retrain as a urologist where this sort of thing was more acceptable, a profession he was in for the rest of his life. There was no way he could get his hospital's board to approve something like this, not with a live patient. So he convinced a nurse by the name of Gerda Ditson to help him sneak into the hospital and perform a procedure in which he would run a catheter through a vein in the arm right into a human heart. She agreed on one condition, that the test be performed on her. Werner wasn't about to kill another human being if he was wrong, though. After she sat down in a chair and he tied her arm down to prep for the operation, he quickly ran into a back room while she was restrained and ran the catheter into his own arm all the way down into his own heart and snapped an X-ray photo to prove that the catheter had made it all the way in. And that's why we have heart surgery. Story 6. Clara Barton rallies the U.S. to take better care of their troops on the battlefield. She saw the basically non-existent medical care on the field and was horrified. When no one would do anything about it, she volunteered herself to go out to the front lines to care for the wounded. Naturally, she was met with resistance at first because she was a woman, and she shouldn't have been out on the battlefield at all. But she was so persistent that they let her and a small group of other women she'd rallied to go out at their own risk. She became a legend among the soldiers, an angel on the battlefield. She was a source of hope when things were at their most dire. Of course, she couldn't be everywhere all at once, but she still developed a reputation for swooping in to save soldiers when they needed her most. The soldiers' families sent her hundreds of letters of gratitude. She also made speeches around the country rallying the wives and mothers to make blankets and send food to the cause so she had better supplies. This eventually led to her founding the American Red Cross. What a legendary woman. Story 7. In our history, we have a few people who had taken the matter into their own hands, but there was rarely anyone who begged for death himself. Pantai Norasinha, the helmsman, had been a helmsman for an Ayutthayan king in the late 18th century. Now, the story goes that he met the king during a boxing match where the king disguised himself as a commoner and fought in the ring. The king liked him and summoned him into the court to give services. He ended up steering for the king's boat. One day, he was steering the king's boat in a river full of bends, and he accidentally knocked the boat's head off when it hit a riverside tree. Per tradition, that stuff was punishable by death because it was the king's ship, plus saw the bad omens. Now, the king liked this guy very much and was ready to pardon him, as he knew that the river was itself very hard to steer past without any problem, but the guy insisted. So he made a clay dummy and had people chop off its head in a ceremony. However, that was still not enough. Norasinha still insisted on the king taking his head and said that if the king did not execute him, he would have set a bad example for his men, and they would have seen him as weak. So even though the king loved Norasinha as if they were brothers, he had to execute him. Afterward, a shrine was erected in his honor and the river was expanded so that no one would find any trouble traveling through it. The ban was also made into an icon of incorruptible honesty and loyalty. There's a brand of Thai sauces named after him, and it is one of the best things Thailand has to offer. I would highly suggest you try it. Story 8. The Wright Brothers. Every time a so-called aeronautical expert caught wind of what they were doing and tried to help, if anything, it set them back. They got the best available tables showing lift and drag for different wing shapes, designed a glider accordingly, and went to Kitty Hawk, and the thing was terrible. They went back to Ohio and started from scratch, building their own testing apparatus and generating their own data, which they used to redesign the glider for the next year. This happened all the time while they were painstakingly figuring out how to make powered flight work over several years. They not only built and repaired everything themselves, but they built the sheds to house their equipment and sewed the fabric used on the wings. The only thing they really farmed out to someone else was the engines and drive chains. Everyone else who was trying to be first in flight at the time was willing to contribute only one part of the larger puzzle. Either they wanted to design but not pilot, or pilot but not fund, or hold big press events before they take any kind of success, etc. The brothers swallowed the whole pill and got it done despite innumerable setbacks and no funding. Two incredible people with so much stoicism and determination, especially in the case of Wilbur. It almost makes them sound like a different species when you read about them. Story 9. Katarinas Forza was the illegitimate child of the Duke of Milan in the late 15th century Italy. She was married off at 14 to the nephew of the Pope, moved to Rome, and, as was customary at the time, was granted, along with her husband, several fiefs and offices to provide ample income. When her husband's uncle died, a conclave was announced to select a new pope. As she, her husband, and her late uncle Pope had made a crap ton of enemies, as one often does in Renaissance Italy, the likely outcome was the election of a pope who would be inclined to make them return everything and give their lands and offices to other people. Now, her husband wasn't the most stable man out there, to put it kindly, so at 7 months pregnant, she got on a horse, rode into the Castel Sant'Angelo, and pointed the artillery and cannon at the city. Pretty much holding Rome hostage, the cardinals fled out of fear and postponed the election of a new pope. But it goes even further than that. Exasperated and popeless, the cardinals met with her husband at his army's camp outside of the city and offered him terms that seemed favorable enough that he agreed to lift the siege of the city. When she was informed, however, she swiftly reminded him that this was her siege, not his, and kept the artillery focused on the city and raised the pay of her soldiers, demanding that the cardinals negotiate with her, not him. Pissed, her husband and his troops took a position against the fortress, essentially setting the scene for a three-way battle between the cardinals, Katarina, and her husband. At the cusp of giving birth, the three sides finally came to an agreement, and Katarina rode out of the city, still pregnant, towards the fiefdoms she had been granted and, by her own wit, was allowed to retain even with the election of a pope hostile to her family's interest. This is only the surface. Look her up, and there are barely any humans who come as close to being the embodiment of "screw it, I'll do it" as her. Story 10. Isaac Brock, Lieutenant Governor of Upper Canada, essentially being told, do your best, try to hold Halifax come to the War of 1812, as Britain was busy with Napoleon in Europe. He goes and cements a strategic alliance with the natives under Tecumseh, trains a huge military, and raises funds to buy weapons outside of his budget. Doesn't wait for the inevitable invasion, he goes on the offensive. Through brilliant subterfuge, he convinces Fort Detroit that it's hopelessly surrounded and outnumbered, getting them to surrender without a shot. Then treks 500 kilometers east to Niagara and rallies the defenders just in time to hold off an invasion of American forces. Realizing a strategic hill is in jeopardy of being taken, he personally rallies a sortie and charges up the hill. He takes a cannonball, his last words exhorting the soldiers to press on. Blood rage ensues. The Upper Canada militia pushes the forces back, and Upper Canada remains firmly in the Empire, heading into the winter of 1812. Britain realizes Canada can be saved, commits to its defense, and the war continues for another 2 years. Isaac Brock literally is the reason Canada exists today.